நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரை மலர்த்தாள் வாழ்க.
நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரை மலர்த்தாள் வாழ்க.
Now, having talked about all these various samadhis, about how Bhagavan may or may not have been processing incoming disorders from devotees, I'd like to do a section on Bhagavan looking at devotees making eye-to-eye contact. This was undoubtedly the way that most people who came to him experienced his power and his grace. There was a natural radiation, an ambient background, peace and silence in his presence. Many people have reported that simply by sitting in the hall with Bhagavan they got quiet and peaceful. But there was also this possibility, if you were really lucky, that Bhagavan would turn to you, look at you, make eye contact with you, and give you, if you like, an extra dose, straight from the self darshan, a transmission of power which could bring you silence, peace, even direct experiences of the self. Now, there's one line from an old Tamil scriptural work, Tirukkural, which says, "When eye meets with eye, their gaze in mutual accord, there is no need whatsoever for the spoken word." Now, Bhagavan, I think, endorsed this absolutely. He wanted people to sit quietly in his presence, to absorb the peace and the power that was naturally flowing off him, and occasionally, if he felt that an extra dose was needed, he could look at you and transmit to whoever needed it at that particular moment. Muruggana took this Tirukkural verse, he was a big fan of Tirukkural, and expanded it into a 4-line verse which he included in Guru Vachika Kova. I'd like to read it out because it's in a way, it's the thematic verse of all the quotes that will follow. So Muruggana wrote, "The Guru abides as the silent benefactor who reveals the light that shines as the one and only eternal residue. If his eyes and the eyes of the disciple meet in total harmony, spoken words are redundant." This is what Bhagavan always said. Words are not necessary. If you can commune with, resonate with, partake of the Guru's inner silence, then you don't need to have a conversation, you don't need to get advice, follow the advice. Just being there, being quiet is enough. I would like to give some devotees' accounts. I can't do justice by narrating these stories myself, so I'm going to let a whole group of disparate devotees tell in their own words what happened when they sat in front of Bhagavan and had the wonderful opportunity, the wonderful experience of having Bhagavan look at them. Now, the first one is a man called Daivarata, who was an early devotee. He was here in the 2nd decade of the last century, and this is what he had to say. "The benefit derived from Maharshi's darshan and teachings is immense, wonderful beyond description. On getting Maharshi's darshan only, all the doubts in one's mind are cleared, and one's desire to know is also fulfilled. This itself is a sign of his spiritual greatness. His eyes always glitter with spotless light, full of peace and pure love. Like the gods, his eyes never blink. They are always open. His eyelids do not close of their own accord. Even though his eyes are so wide open, they remain very steady and introverted. In other words, he does not see external objects with a desire to get any impression from them. He is always absorbed in the heart. Serenity reigns on his face, the mere sight of which gives exceeding joy to all of us." The second is an illiterate child widow. In India, girls are married often when they're 8 or 9 years old. This is a lady called Akalandama, whose groom died before she had a chance to live a proper married life. She devoted all her time thereafter to serving sadhus, in particular Bhagavan, in Tiruvannamalai. She came from a village about 40 miles from here, and she used to walk here to see him, to bring food to him, and to serve the devotees. This is how she describes her first visit to Bhagavan in Virupaksha cave. When I came to Bhagavan, he was seated like a rock outside the cave, without altering his look, which was filled with grace, compassion, and steady wisdom. I also stood by his side. After giving me a look, he opened the gate of my heart, and I was also established in his state. In those days, Bhagavan used to open our heart with a simple, gracious look and transform us. There was no need for any questions, since he made us, by his look, like himself. This is wonderful. This is a woman who couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't talk philosophy, never did any spiritual practice. She stood in front of Bhagavan at Virupaksha cave. He looked at her, and as she said, he opened the gate of my heart, and I was established in his state. The next is a little more wordy because it's a professional author. This is an account by Paul Brunton, the man who put Bhagavan on the map. He came here about 1930 on a tour of India looking for swamis, sadhus, fakirs, and anyone who could impress him. And far and away the most impressive person he encountered was Bhagavan. And this is what he wrote about his experience of sitting with Bhagavan, looking at Bhagavan's eyes and having Bhagavan look at him. It is an ancient theory of mine that one can take the inventory of a man's soul from his eyes. But before those of the Maharshi I hesitate, puzzled and baffled. The Maharshi turns and looks down into my face. I, in turn, gaze expectantly up at him. I become aware of a mysterious change taking place with great rapidity in my heart and mind. The old motives which have lured me on begin to desert me. The urgent desires which have sent my feet hither and thither vanish with incredible swiftness. The dislikes, misunderstandings, coldnesses, and selfishness which have marked my dealings with many of my fellows collapse into the abyss of nothingness. An untellable peace falls upon me, and I know that there is nothing further I shall ask from life. His eyes shine with astonishing brilliance. Strange sensations begin to arise in me. Those lustrous orbs seem to be peering into the inmost recesses of my soul. In a peculiar way, I feel aware of everything he can see in my heart. His mysterious glance penetrates my thoughts, my emotions, and my desires. I am helpless before it. At first, this disconcerting gaze troubles me. I become vaguely uneasy. I feel that he has perceived pages that belong to a past which I have forgotten. He knows it all, I am certain. I am powerless to escape. Somehow I do not want to either. Some curious intimation of future benefit forces me to endure that pitiless gaze. And so he continues to catch the feeble quality of my soul for a while, to perceive my motley past, to sense the mixed emotions which have drawn me this way and that. But I feel that he understands also what mind-devastating quest has impelled me to leave the common way and seek out men such as he. There comes a perceptible change in the telepathic current which plays between us, and while my eyes blink frequently, but his remain without the least tremor, I become aware that he is definitely linking my own mind with his, that he is provoking my heart into that state of starry calm which he seems perpetually to enjoy. In this extraordinary peace I find a sense of exaltation and lightness. Time seems to stand still. My heart is released from its burden of care. Never again, I feel, shall the bitterness of anger and the melancholy of unsatisfied desire afflict me. I realize deeply that the profound instinct which is innate in the race, which bids man look up, which encourages him to hope on, and which sustains him when life has darkened, is a true instinct, for the essence of being is good. In this beautiful, entranced silence, when the clock stands still, and the sorrows and errors of the past seem like trivialities, my mind is being submerged in that of the Maharishi, and wisdom is now at its perihelion. What is this man's gaze but a thaumaturgic wand which evokes a hidden world of unexpected splendor before my profane eyes? Next is not Arthur Osborne directly. Arthur Osborne was the principal chronicler of Bhagavan in the 1950s and 60s, edited and published a series of books which brought the next generation of devotees to Bhagavan. after Brunton had brought the first wave in the 30s and 40s. This is what Osborne had to say in Ramana Maharshi in The Path of Self-Knowledge, his biography of Bhagavan. The initiation by look was a very real thing. Sri Bhagavan would turn to the devotee, his eyes fixed upon him with blazing intentness. The luminosity, the power of his eyes pierced into one, breaking down the thought process. Sometimes it was as though an electric current was passing through one, sometimes a vast peace, a flood of light. One devotee has described it in the following way, quote, "Suddenly Bhagavan turned his luminous, transparent eyes on me. Before that I could not stand his gaze for long. Now I looked right back into those terrible, wonderful eyes. For how long I could not tell. They held me in a sort of vibration, distinctly audible to me." End quote. And Osborne concludes, "And always it was followed by the feeling, the indubitable conviction that one had been taken up by Sri Bhagavan, and that henceforth he was in charge, he was guiding." The next little account is by G.V. Subramaya. He was a Telugu professor who came to Bhagavan, wrote a book about his experiences, edited, translated a number of ashram texts. And this is a story about how he came, how he had his first experience, and after that there'll be a second story by him. "For over 2 years I've been reading the works of Sri Bhagavan and other ashram literature. My main interest had been literary rather than philosophical. In the morning I had darshan of Sri Bhagavan in the old hall. As our eyes met, there was a miraculous effect upon my mind. I felt as if I had plunged into a pool of peace, and with eyes shut sat in a state of ecstasy for nearly an hour." On a separate occasion he wrote this, "His eyes were wide open, fixed and steady. He seemed to be seeing through me and beyond into the infinite. I had never had such a gaze from Sri Bhagavan before. I felt like Arjuna in Viswarupa Sandarshan. I was face to face with pure divine majesty and stood there spellbound." Now, Subramaya had a number of family dramas, and this is an interesting story insofar as it produces an explanation from Bhagavan on how devotees who appeal to jnanis for help get help, but not directly from Bhagavan. On October 31st, 1937, my 2-year-old daughter Indira suffered 2 fits, the second more severe than the first. Suddenly she became unconscious, all vital organs stopped functioning and she seemed practically dead. At this crisis my eye lighted upon the picture of Sri Bhagavan, and I prostrated, saying within, "O Bhagavan, all human aid having failed, you alone must save her." Getting up, I mechanically opened the drawer, took out a telegraph form, and sent an express message praying for Sri Bhagavan's grace upon the child. The child, of course, recovered. During Christmas, when I again visited the ashram, I asked Sri Bhagavan what he thought on reading my telegram. He merely said, "Yes, I read your message." So I asked, "Bhagavan, did you not think that you must do something to save my child?" Straight away came Sri Bhagavan's reply, "Even the thought to save the child is a sankalpa, an intention. One who has any sankalpa or intention is no jnani. In fact, such thinking is unnecessary. The moment the jnani's eye falls upon a thing, there starts a divine automatic action which itself leads to the highest good." Now, this is an experience which many people can vouch for. But Bhagavan generally spoke in Tamil, Telugu, occasionally Malayalam. But there was one little catchphrase in English that he sometimes said, automatic divine activity. I don't know why he felt the English was better, but he said this is how the jnani works. You bring a problem to the attention of a jnani. If he reads in a letter or a telegram that you, your family, have some sort of problem, he doesn't think, yes, I must do something, or I must feel compassion towards this devotee with a problem. He said, bringing the problem to the attention of a jnani, you can do it by prayer, you can do it mentally, you can send a physical message, and the moment the jnani sees or hears about your problem, that triggers or initiates a response, a chain reaction which somehow channels the power and grace of the self in the direction of the person who asked for help. The help would come automatically, problems would get solved, miraculous healings would take place. But then when devotees came back to Bhagavan and said, "Oh, Bhagavan, you saved me," as often as not, Bhagavan wouldn't even be aware of what had happened, and if he was, he would always deny having any role in what had happened. He says, nobody in the state ever thinks, I must help this person. Nobody in the state ever thinks, I have done something, I have saved someone. He said, you bring a problem to the attention of a jnani, and simply putting the fact of the problem in his consciousness automatically produces a result which solves the problem.
Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravazhga Vimochanameyan Viraima.
The next account I'm going to read out was written by Chaganlal Yogi, a man from Bombay, who for several years had run a big printing press there. He was not a happy man when he lived in Mumbai. He was miserable, depressed, and had more or less given up on sadhus, ashrams, temples, thinking they were all a big scam to delude the credulous. I think his trip to Ramanashram was a kind of last-ditch attempt to convince himself that there might be some kind of genuine teacher in the world, but he didn't arrive in a very good frame of mind. He said he was depressed, and his first impressions of Ramanashram were not favourable. But after he had been introduced to Bhagavan by Chinnaswami, Bhagavan found out where he was from, called for a copy of Upadeshasaram, which had recently been translated into Gujarati, and asked him to chant some of the verses. Chaganlal Yogi was very hesitant. He was a little bit shy. He didn't think he was a very good chanter. But when it became clear that Bhagavan wasn't going to take no for an answer, he rather hesitatingly started to chant the work. He said, as Bhagavan looked at him while he was chanting, a complete transformation of his level of happiness, unhappiness happened. This is what he wrote. All the time I was chanting, I could feel Sri Bhagavan keenly observing me. It seemed that the light of his eyes was suffusing my consciousness, even without my being aware of it. His silent gaze brought about a subtle but definite transformation in me. The darkness which a few minutes before had seemed heavy and unbearable gradually lightened and melted into a glow of well-being. My erstwhile sadness completely disappeared, leaving in my heart an inexplicable emotion of joy. My limbs appeared to have been washed in an ocean tide of freedom. Now, I had not originally planned to tell this next story, but reading those words from Chaganlal Yogi has reminded me of a lovely story that was told to me by Katya Osborne, Lucia and Arthur Osborne's daughter, and it dates from the time when they had the only house in Ramananagar near Ramanashram that was owned by a foreigner. Because of this, when stray foreigners arrived at Ramanashram with nowhere to stay, they were sent to the Osborne house, so it became a kind of de facto dormitory for all the strays who weren't Indian to sleep for the night and get fed there and sent to the ashram. Katya told me that one of the many people who came was a woman who just seemed to exude depression. She was a crabby, miserable, unhappy woman who just didn't seem to have any reason to want to live. Nobody quite knew why she'd come, but they put her up as the ashram had requested. They fed her breakfast and sent her off to sit in the ashram along with everybody else in the old hall. That lunchtime she came back to eat the lunch which the Osbornes cooked for their guests, and everybody could see that some kind of massive transformation had taken place. The sadness, the aura of depression had gone. She had a happy, radiant, smiling face. So they all thought something great has happened this morning. She's going to tell us all about it. But they didn't push her. They waited to have her tell her story in her own time. So she sat down, she ate her lunch. Everybody finished. Still no story came along. And at the end of the meal, they couldn't wait anymore. They wanted to know what had happened in Bhagavan's presence that had caused such a change. So one of the Osbornes said, well, what happened this morning? And she said, well, what do you mean, what happened? I went to the ashram, I sat there for 2 hours, and I've come home. Nothing happened. So this woman was completely oblivious to the fact that she had left the Osborne house that morning in her usual crabby, miserable state. She'd sat in the old hall with Ramana for most of the morning, and something had seeped into her. The aura, the presence in that hall, had done a transformation that was so deep. Everybody who saw her walk out of that building commented on the fact that she was absolutely radiant. She wasn't the person who'd walked in several hours before. And yet this woman was completely unaware of what had happened. She hadn't asked any questions, she hadn't interacted with Ramana anyway. She just sat at the back, watched proceedings, come out and come home. But somehow in those few hours, the ambient presence that was coming off Sri Ramana completely transformed her without her being aware of it. This, for me, is, in a sense, the classic before and after story for people coming to see Bhagavan. There was something about sitting in that hall. You didn't have to talk to him, you didn't have to have a question and answer session, he didn't even necessarily have to look at you. If you sat there for a few hours, there was a reasonably high probability that you'd walk out at the end of that session with a big smile on your face, feeling like a completely different, happier being. Now the next story is a more direct one. It comes from Kunju Swami, who met Bhagavan for the first time around 1920. He had arrived from Kerala full of enthusiasm, wanting to take Bhagavan as his guru, and this is his account of what happened on the first meeting. Because the plague had driven away most of the inhabitants of the town, visitors to Sri Bhagavan were very few. I was therefore left alone with Sri Bhagavan for much of the time. While we were together, he often used to look at me, and as he did so, I became aware that his eyes had a strange brilliance and fascination in them. Whenever I looked into his eyes for any length of time, I saw a bright effulgence. I could not say from where it came, but it had the effect of making me forget everything. It was not like sleep, for I was fully aware. I was also filled with a strange peace and bliss. After each experience, I would come back to my normal physical state with a shudder. This occurred again and again on each of the 18 days that I stayed with Sri Bhagavan. I was like someone intoxicated. I was absolutely indifferent to everything, had no curiosity to see anything, no desires whatsoever. Whatever activities I did them all in a very mechanical way. So long as I stayed in the presence of Sri Bhagavan, I continued to have these experiences of peace and bliss. Because of the greatness of the presence of Sri Bhagavan, I was able to experience the tranquil state of abiding firmly in the heart. Kunju Swami is one of the many people who are known to us. He was here for several decades. He wrote about his experiences. But there's another subcategory of people that has always intrigued me. People who heard about Bhagavan, came, sat there for perhaps 1 day, 2 days, had an experience that completely transformed them, and then they simply got up and left without even identifying themselves or saying where they came from. I think there are a lot of people who were in a very advanced state, who heard about Bhagavan, and just one visit, one strong, deep experience was enough. They would come, they would have their experience, there would be some internal recognition of gratitude towards Bhagavan, then they would get up, the transaction would be over, and they would go on their way. This is perhaps the most, I wouldn't say typical, but the one that sums up all these aspects of this category of person for me. It's an unknown foreigner who arrived, I think, sometime in the 1940s. One morning, a European man came in a horse carriage to the ashram and went straight to Bhagavan. He wrote something on a piece of paper and showed it to him, but Bhagavan made no reply. Instead, he gazed at the stranger with unwinking eyes while the stranger gazed back at him. Then, after Bhagavan had closed his eyes and the stranger had also closed his, they both remained motionless for a long time. When it was time to eat, the meals were served, but Bhagavan would not open his eyes. Madhava Swami, the attendant, got Bhagavan's water pot and stood ready to lead Bhagavan out of the hall, but Bhagavan did not stir. We all felt afraid to go near him, such was the intensity of power around him. His face was glowing with a strange light. The guests in the dining room were waiting, and the food before them was getting cold. Chinnaswami was talking loudly to attract Bhagavan's attention. Even vessels were being banged about, but to no avail. It was only when the clock struck 12 that Bhagavan opened his eyes. We all noticed that they were glowing very brightly. Madhavaswami took up the water pot while the European got into his carriage and went away. It was the last we ever saw of him. We did not even get his name. Everybody was wonderstruck at the great good fortune of the man who had received such an intense and immediate initiation from Bhagavan. This reminds me of another little story. A devotee was pestering Bhagavan with what Bhagavan obviously thought were far too many pointless questions. Finally, Bhagavan said, "Why can't you be quiet? Why can't you be like those people who come here, sit down, get the experience and leave without even leaving us their name?" I think this unknown foreign person comes into this category. Bhagavan did seem to accept that there were people who came to him, sat in front of him, got an experience of the self, and left without even identifying themselves, whereas the vast majority of people who were in a far less mature state sat there for years and kept quizzing him on how to get enlightened. This is the final story, and it's an extraordinarily powerful account of a Dutchman called Walter Keers. Walter was brought up in Indonesia. As a boy, somebody casually mentioned that he had been to British India. That's what the Dutch called it. And as soon as he heard the word British India, he felt there was a spasm of ecstasy in him. There was some connection with his source, and he knew he had to go to India and find out what this mysterious British India had to offer. He came to Bhagavan in 1949, not long before Bhagavan passed away. And I mention this because, irrespective of how old and apparently enfeebled Bhagavan became to onlookers' eyes, there was never the slightest diminution in the power he had to wake people up, the power he had to put people into silence. There are stories, there isn't time today, but there are stories I could tell you of people, new people, standing in the darshan line in front of the room where Bhagavan passed away, meeting him for the first time a week before he passed away, getting full, unmediated experiences of the self. Bhagavan might have looked like he was sick and dying, but the power of the self coming off him, radiating through him, never diminished at all. It was always there, always available for full transmission if the right person came along. So this is Walter talking about a couple of experiences he had, extraordinary ones with Bhagavan. This will be my final story. Long, long ago, when I was very young, I had believed that God was some magnificent being, having a human form that radiated light and goodness. I had long since abandoned this childhood belief, believing it to be a fairy story that was told only to credulous children. Yet now this childhood belief turned out to be true, because here before me was a human form that seemed to be made of light itself. How to describe what I experienced on that first morning? God became manifest before my eyes, announcing his presence to me by radiating a blazing, penetrating light, a light that went right through me like X-rays. That was his first encounter. A few days later, Walter was asking Bhagavan mentally to give him a direct experience of the self. And this is what Walter wrote later. Bhagavan turned in my direction and looked at me with a smile of utter amazement on his face. "What do you want?" said his smile. Then his expression changed, and its new configuration exclaimed, "You are looking for your glasses. They are on your nose." No words passed his lips, but these messages came to me with unbelievable clarity. There was no doubt or conjecture or imagination. Bhagavan continued to gaze at me. Perhaps he was waiting for some kind of response. Suddenly his eyes emitted light and spat fire at me. I can think of no other way of describing that sudden explosion in his gaze. His powerful look went straight into me, boring away at everything that made me think I was different and separate from him. I felt the right-hand side heart center begin to get warm. I had often felt it in the course of my meditation, and I'd often had the feeling of being absorbed and consumed by the center. But this was something completely different. The heart center got warmer and warmer as he continued to gaze at me, until I felt it to be a hot, fiery ball glowing inside me. It felt as if Bhagavan were charging it with some immensely powerful spiritual electricity, because, as he continued to look at me, I had the unmistakable feeling that this heart center was some kind of spiritual dynamo that was emitting sparks of light and energy. I felt as if some enormously potent electric apparatus had suddenly been transplanted into my chest. I sat rigid and straight, my eyes glued to his. Fire flowed from his glowing eyes and drilled into the core of my being. "Kill me," I prayed. How long this transmission lasted, I cannot say. Time and space had no meaning in that never-ending moment when our eyes were locked together. At some point, though, I realized that my body could no longer stand the strain. The fire in my chest had expanded to the point where I felt that I was about to explode. Mentally, I asked him to let me go. I had received what I had come for. In writing this account of the initiation I received from him as his eyes met mine, I realize I've only given the briefest explanation and indication of what actually happened in those moments. There was a complete transformation inside and out, and it all happened without a word being spoken. That communication through silence was clearer and more direct than any explanation that could have been given in words.
Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravazha விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரைமலத்தாள் வாழ்க.
நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க. விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரைமலத்தாள் வாழ்க. நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க. விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரைமலத்தாள் வாழ்க. அடிமுடிக்குண்டாய அநாதித் தொடர்பின் விடமுடியாமை மறந்து